All right, guys, so the U.S. debt just topped $31 trillion. Now, last I checked, it's past $32 trillion already. Check this out.
If you stacked up the full debt of the United States in $100 bills, you could make not one, not two, but 13 piles of cash as tall as the Washington Monument.
Back in the year 2000, it was a relatively easy lift. The debt equaled just 36% of the combined earnings, goods, and everything the U.S. economy produced that year. But it shot up, and now the U.S. is shouldering a national debt that is 98% of what we will produce this year. And much worse, if nothing changes, in 30 years, the debt is forecast to soar, to be nearly twice as large as everything the economy produces, a potentially overwhelming weight for the U.S. economy.
As the debt keeps creeping up, we just are placing a greater and greater burden on the next generation.
Michael Peterson is CEO of the Peterson Foundation, a nonprofit group focused on the U.S. budget long term. And he's particularly worried about the cost of the debt.
The interest cost is really what is the cost of the debt. If you think over a long period of time, by about 2050, approximately 50% of federal revenues will go towards interest only.
That means by 2053, when little kids today are in their 30s, the interest costs on the national debt will be the largest expenditure the federal government has. And 50%, half of the taxes that these guys pay, will go to those interest costs.
That will constrict funding for everything, including what we mentioned earlier, healthcare, the military, food stamps, education, and the environment. Even Social Security benefits would be significantly cut.
There is still time to change course and multiple ways to address the debt. But the longer lawmakers wait to tackle it, the deeper and more painful future cuts and the future burden will be. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Lisa Desjardins.
In just the time it took Lisa to tell that story, the U.S. slipped nearly $10 million deeper into debt. And each passing second brings the country closer to a first-ever default. Lisa has spent the day chasing down lawmakers, and she now joins us to bring us up to speed. Lisa, a terrific report on the debt there. But back to these talks on Capitol Hill. We are right at the precipice here. What is the current status of negotiations?
We're getting close. As you said, I was on the Hill with our producer, Kyle Medora. This is where we are. Talks are at a standstill at this moment. In fact, Speaker McCarthy earlier today said talks had broken down. Really, there is some agreement over many areas, but they are not making any distance over two big areas. That is work requirements, which Republicans want to add more of for some benefits. And then the other one, here you see the White House lawmakers coming in for the morning meeting. Republicans also say there's Speaker McCarthy, simply too far apart when it comes to spending and funding. One dynamic we've seen today, William, is Speaker McCarthy again and again coming and talking to reporters. Republicans feel like they're winning the sort of public argument here. We're seeing Democrats just starting to speak to us more. But I think right now the House is expected to recess on Thursday with no deal. And I think this weekend we could still be talking about this.
Well, you, I know, in addition to all your other reporting, have some reporting about what the Treasury Department might be doing in case we get to this dreaded moment. What is that?
Sources familiar have confirmed that the U.S. Treasury has sent out notices to government agencies asking them to hold off on any payments that don't have specific due dates right now. It's something that maybe pro forma or just kind of happenstance. They were sending out these payments, but they can wait. They have a deadline that they don't have to meet. They're saying hold back on that. The U.S. Treasury essentially trying to hold on to some kind of cushion of cash because it is getting concerned that we're close to the deadline and it may come down to a few $100 million, which is usually not a lot for the U.S. Treasury, but could make a big difference in these negotiations.
Sure, the United States has the world's largest economy with a GDP of roughly $23.3 trillion in 2021, but that debt is almost equally that big. Basically, you got years of big spending that's exceeded what the U.S. government has been bringing in, and voila. You got the world's largest national debt. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio, which compares the size of the debt to the economy, also ranks among the highest in the world. We're not trying to win this race here. But let's take a step back first, all right? So what does $31.5 trillion look like, right? Well, let's just go ahead and bring home exactly how large this is. So first, let's go ahead and flip the script. If they turn that $31.4 trillion into stimulus checks for the 332 million people in our population that we have, Well, every man, woman, and child would receive more than $94,000 in stimulus checks. Now, if only the 38 million Americans living below the poverty line received a share of that $31.5 trillion in debt, each person would get about $826,000 in checks. Now, let's go ahead and talk about gold, shall we? So at the price of roughly $1,800 per ounce right now, the $31.4 trillion could buy about 542,595 tons of gold. The total amount of gold mined in history is estimated to be about 197,576 tons. And this one, stacking dollar bills, right? So if $31.4 trillion bills were actually stacked up one on top of one another, the pile would reach more than 3.45 million kilometers high. The moon is about 384,000 kilometers away from Earth. And so this means that the pile would reach the moon almost 9 times. Basically, the moon and back, as they say. So adjusting for inflation, the NASA Apollo program that got us to the moon was about $257 billion in 2020 dollars. So that $31.4 trillion US debt could actually fund the space program, which included 6 missions that landed humans on the moon many dozens of times over. And we can't not talk about the war, right? War is expensive, no? So according to one estimate, the US led post-September 11th wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere have cost about $8 trillion, which, by the way, was almost entirely paid for by borrowing, which has added to the US national debt. Brown University's cost of war projects estimates that the interest payments could total over $6.5 trillion by the 2050s. Rich Nations has promised at the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009 to channel $100 billion a year to less wealthy nations by 2020 to help them to adapt to climate change and to reduce emissions. In 2022, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry, he said that the target would be met in 2023. In an ideal world, $31.4 trillion could have funded this climate fight until around 2330. And I think what often gets unmentioned is approximately 80% of the operational budget of the United States government goes to paying the salaries, the perks, the lifelong pensions, medical and early retirement fees of U.S. government employees. I mean, when we talk about government spending in generic terms, most don't realize that the government is actually spending that money on itself, basically writing and legislating their own paychecks. I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. Now, if you guys like our content, talking about the real news, don't forget to show your support, light up the like button, and also subscribe to the channel. That way we can keep the channel going and actually reach more people out there. The road to 500K, guys, let's go. But hey, if you're anything like me, you probably have noticed the signs on the wall. It's pretty clear that the government is caught in a very tough spot right now. With a whopping debt of over $32 trillion, their spending is skyrocketing at $5.3 trillion this year alone, and that is a 10% increase from last year. Funding the Ukraine war didn't exactly help us out. And to make matters worse, the revenues are down by about 10%, which is $3.6 trillion this year. Clearly, they're falling way short of what is needed for covering their spending, leading to these growing deficits, which is up a staggering 122% this year. But here's a real kicker, guys. Interest rates and the government's loans, they're getting ready to shoot up to levels not seen in ages. And this whole situation seems like a recipe for a sovereign debt crisis. And you know what's even clearer? The only way the government could keep from defaulting in the long run is by firing up that money printer yet again. Now, when the public catches wind of this, you can bet your bottom dollar that everyone will start shifting their wealth into assets or safe havens that can shield themselves from the effects of the currency losing value. And when everyone does this, the government's grand plan to seize wealth as a way to rescue their financial mess goes down the drain. So if wealth is squirreled away to protect it from inflation, the government's hands are pretty much tied. And that is when they pull out their playbook. Ever heard of capital controls? It's kind of like putting a leash on your money, and financial repression enters the scene. It's an old trick that has been pulled in various corners of the world countless times. For a while now, the US and other countries globally have been gearing up to play the same game. Definitely scary stuff, guys. And the way that the US national debt is ballooning, it may just be a matter of time. In fact, it's just prompted Fitch Ratings to issue a surprising downgrade to the nation's long-term credit score in early August. The agency cut the U.S. debt by one notch from a great AAA rating to a lower AA plus grade. Fitch mentioning things like alarm over the country's deteriorating finances and concerns over the government's ability to address the ballooning debt burden amid sharp political divisions. Not a good sign here. Economists are calling it a warning shot fired across the U.S. government's bow that it needs to right its financial ship. And it makes sense here, right? You honestly can't just spend trillions of dollars more than you have in revenue every single year and expect no ill consequences, right? The latest findings from the Congressional Budget Office indicate that the national debt will nearly double in size over the next 3 decades. Now, at the end of 2022, the national gross debt was around 97% of gross domestic product. Now, if we do the math, the figure is expected to skyrocket to 181% at the end of 2053, almost double what the US economy is even taking in. And when those investors eventually come knocking for their payment, it could risk America's economic standing in the world, threatening our economy and the next generation. Now, I think I speak for a lot of Americans here that this is not the future that any of us want. And it's no way to run a great nation like ours, right? What do you guys think? By the way, if you own a home, make sure your home is protected. Never be caught off guard by another very expensive home repair again. Get your free home warranty quote. There's a link in the description down below this video. Now, let's not forget the burst of spending by President Biden and the Democratic lawmakers. As of September 2022, Biden had already approved roughly $4.8 trillion in borrowing, including $1.85 trillion for a C-19 relief measure dubbed the American Rescue Plan, and $370 billion for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Now, while that is about half of the $7.5 trillion that former President Donald Trump added to the deficit while he was in office, it's far more than the $2.5 trillion that Trump had approved at the same point in time during his term. And I don't have to tell you guys, financial times are different now. More specifically, interest rates are much higher these days, meaning that the cost of servicing the national debt is much more expensive. And as interest rates continue to rise, the federal government's borrowing costs on its debt will also increase. In fact, interest payments on the national debt are projected to be the fastest growing part of the federal budget over the next 3 decades. Payments are expected to triple from nearly $475 billion in fiscal year 2022 to a stunning $1.4 trillion by 2032. Now, by 2053, the interest payments are projected to surge to $5.4 trillion. Now, to put this into perspective, that will be more than the U.S. spends on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and all other mandatory and discretionary spending programs. And you know how easily they could use that as a reason to cut programs like Social Security payments or even Medicare, right? You don't have to have an Ivy League school financial education to know that we're in deep trouble here, or at least our government is. It's really hard not to see how problematic the government is at everything that they do. I mean, like, what do you guys think? And here's something that they proved in a recent House committee hearing on oversight and accountability. The subcommittee on healthcare and financial services held a hearing titled Inflation, a Preventable Crisis. At this hearing, the subcommittee members asked expert witnesses how the fiscal policies pursued by President Biden, including the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act, have overstimulated the economy, increased inflation on Americans, and created slush funds for the Democrats' radical agendas. Subcommittee Republican members warned that Americans are still facing higher costs due to historically high inflation and the risk of a recession, yet the Biden administration has ignored the damage that they have done to the economy in pursuit of even more damaging tax hikes and spending. And so here's some takeaways from the House hearing. So despite warnings from Republicans and even former President Obama's own economic advisor, Larry Summers, at the American Rescue Plan would trigger inflation, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats rushed through trillions of dollars in spending and fueled the highest inflation in more than half a century. President Biden rushed through spending in the American Rescue Plan, ignoring both warnings of inflation and data that the economy was growing. The ARP, the American Rescue Plan, was just much too big and destined to cause macroeconomic disruptions. The Biden administration doubled down on reckless spending with the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act. Democrats spent billions of dollars in the IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act, even though there were still funds left over from prior relief bills. As a result, the price of groceries increased by more than 11%. Inflation has driven the massive increases in the price of groceries and energy, causing extreme stress on hardworking Americans and American families. And experts say that we're not done with this inflationary episode. Food, energy, and shelter, they're all going to be rising at 8.5% year over year. Now, if we go to the gas station, go to the grocery store, go home, and we'll be reminded that your paycheck is nearly 10% less valuable than it was a year ago. So at this point, though, it's largely a blame game among our politicians. President Joe Biden blames Vladimir Putin. Republicans blame Biden and the Democrats. Some economists and Wall Streeters, they put it on the Fed. Everyone's pointing fingers over this dramatic spike in inflation in the United States over the past year that has simply just wiped out wage gains, driven stocks to their worst start to a year since 1970, and generally put Americans in a funk about the nation's direction. Critics predict that eventually they're going to convert physical dollars to digital dollars. Basically, more control that way. Now, with digital dollars, money will no longer be off the books. VAT could easily be introduced with every transaction, and since it's digital, you will not be able to avoid that VAT. Central banks have been prepping for this for years. Just something to think about, guys. If you made it this far in the video, drop a quick like for the video. Also subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.